Bloody video games. They've caused their fair share of drama over the years, with violent action and gory killing attributed to all kinds of
I
societal
wonder if
harm.
this is the one with Mortal Kombat.
These days, a certain amount of bloodshed is tolerated, but not so long ago, a splash of red pixels was all it took to start a fuss.
Yeah, I think I
Join
said
me
this already.
as I prepare to dive knee-deep into blood, guts,
Maybe
and
not.
video games.
Maybe not.
Death is no stranger to gaming. From the very beginning, the need for a failure state has led to the morbid metaphor in each game over. The technical limitations of the earliest video games made the realistic depiction of bloodshed difficult. Detailed injury impossible to render with low-resolution monochrome graphics. Instead of anything more grisly, in 1975's Gunfight, slain opponents simply crumple into a heap and exclaim, "Got me." The first video game to really cause controversy was Death Race in 1976, in which you run over innocent pedestrians to score points. But despite the fuss, the game's visuals are tame.
0.5 POG.
For most of the golden era of arcades, violence was limited to either exploding space aliens or cutesy cartoon violence. Realism wasn't a major consideration. By the mid-1980s, we saw a slow emergence of bloodier games, fueled by a mix of popular horror and action movies, and the contemporary system's increased ability to fling red pixels across the screen. It did take a while. 1982's rendition of Texas Chainsaw Massacre on the Atari 2600 wasn't quite the gore-fest you'd expect. Although the goal of the game was to dismember, it wasn't depicted with any real detail. Chiller in 1986 was very different, however. A full-on torture simulator with a light gun shooting gallery in tow. The game courted controversy from the start, with arcade owners refusing to invest in it. The idea of shooting unarmed innocents deemed distasteful by some. In 1987, the digital rendition of Charles Bronson in Death Wish 3 lived up to the namesake movie, with both enemies and innocent prostitutes alike collapsing into a bloody heap upon the impact of your rocket launcher. By this time though, violent shooter games in the spirit of an action movie were just good clean fun. The Rambo-inspired Ikari warriors might have seen thousands of pixelated soldiers cut down by gunfire, but such mayhem was expected of the shooter genre. Barbarian the Ultimate Warrior managed to find some moral indignation. The bikini-clad box served as the basis for the player's motivation,
Force,
and the game's
I would
violent
like
content
to
wasn't
give
any.
you a hypothetical. Let's say my girlfriend recently left me. She took my dong and went with some sort of doctor. How would you solve this? This is completely hypothetical, of course. Please be as specific as possible.
She took your dong. Well, not much you can do then. I guess you have to start going for men. Now, you can't really say that in the current year, actually. Or whatever you choose to. If I comment, I'm in big trouble.
Any less offensive. In a world where video games are viewed as children's playthings, brutal combat and decapitation doesn't go over well. 1988's Splatterhouse saw the player don a hockey mask and cleave demons in twain, with a protagonist reminiscent of Jason Voorhees. Although not an official tie-in, it was a successful translation of a horror movie, with a cast of grotesque enemies and a variety of weapons at your disposal. As arcade units became more powerful, games like Narc started to unlock the power of a 32-bit address bus, with glorious full-color graphics and copious use of voice samples. Gore was quite prominent, with enemies often exploding into a bloody pulp, although the game is clearly aware of society's limits, as the attack dogs simply shrink and whimper upon incident fire. The end of the 80s gave us Tecmo Knight, a scrolling beat-em-up with decapitation aplenty and bucket loads of blood. And Beastbusters, a rail shooter in the vein of Operation Wolf, in which enemies explode in a satisfyingly visceral fashion. Taito's Space Gun was an Aliens-inspired game, in which you desperately shoot off the enemy's limbs before they lacerate your face. And the Robotron-inspired Smash TV was a gloriously fun arena shooter, a hyper-violent game show in which your goal is to bloodily slaughter incoming waves of opponents. By by the early 90s, the pace of technology was moving fast. 16-bit home machines were the norm, and CD-ROM was slowly emerging as the media of the future, able to hold a whopping 600 megabytes of information. This allowed developers to deliver full motion video content to home console owners. And although crude by today's standards, games like 1992's Night Trap were impressive for the time.
Play this.
Although not particularly gory, the game was known for the controversy it spawned. Realistic acts of violence against women meant the game quickly led to calls for censorship. Another controversial game this year made use of realistic digitized sprites and gruesome finishing moves. None other than Mortal Kombat. A savvy player with the right knowledge could humiliate a defeated opponent with a final killing blow. Such fatalities, normally gratuitously violent procedures, that drove home defeat with explicit dismemberment. Such a gimmick also helped crystallize outrage, and led to the game being upheld in several court cases, in an attempt to either censor such content or more tightly regulate it. Eventually, this action led to the introduction of the ESRB, the Entertainment Software Rating Board, a self-regulatory organization that staved off governmental intervention.
Yeah.
The introduction of ratings such as M for mature helped to quash the
cases,
belief that video games exist solely as children's entertainment, and gave future titles a freer license to explore more adult themes. Mortal Kombat's popularity also inspired many clones, with titles like Blood Warrior poorly aping the digitized warriors and violent finishing moves. Time Killers was notable for its liberal dismemberment, and a critical blow could sever your opponent's head, ending the round instantly. Eternal Champions on the Mega Drive, and later on the Mega CD, took similar notes from Mortal Kombat. Could sever your opponent's head, ending the round instantly. Eternal Champions on the Mega Drive, and later on the Mega CD, took similar notes from Mortal Kombat, with frequently grisly finishing moves marking the end of bouts. The rise of the FPS genre in the 90s followed in the footsteps of the violent shooters of the late 80s. Such titles would cement the word jib into the gaming lexicon.
Jib.
Doom in 1993 proved phenomenally popular, and its violent nature and satanic imagery made it a common target for debate. While for the most part bloodshed was quite measured, should you deal massive damage to an opponent, they would be reduced to a bloody red paste, with a suitably sickening sound effect. Rise of the Triad in '94 was a little more slapstick in its approach, with the complete destruction of your enemies heralded with a shower of blood, guts and eyeballs, with the game proclaiming ludicrous jibs as your reward. Jibbing became the hallmark of the genre, with most later examples permitting the reduction of your opponents into fleshy chunks, at least until ragdoll physics took hold. Meanwhile, the horror-adventure genre was making good use of the improved graphics available, with Phantasmagoria in 1995 blurring the lines between video game and B-movie. With live actors meeting grisly fates, the game was a shade too much for some. Banned in Australia, and many retailers refused to stock it.
What the fuck?
Harvester was similar, released the year after. Realistic digitized characters and the odd gruesome cutscene. As well as chilling adventure, blood and guts would also become an integral part of the survival horror genre, with the bloodier scenes in Resident Evil serving to enhance tension and remind you of your fragile state. The foggy horror of Silent Hill was similar, although much of the game was obscured with an eerie mist. But with horror games, often the things you can't see are far more terrifying than anything in plain sight. The next major controversy was neither a shooter nor horror, but one inspired by Death Race 2000 and featuring high-intensity vehicular manslaughter. In Carmageddon, pedestrians mean points, and points refill your timer, giving more than sufficient motivation for the player to mow down crowds of hapless peds. Of course, the realistic slaughter of innocents rubbed censors the wrong way, and the game was eventually released with green bleeding zombies instead of realistic humans in the UK, and oil-spewing robots in Germany. Some hyper-violent games were even not so lucky to see release, and there exists a cancelled 4-way fighting game for the PS1 called Thrill Kill that had the plug pulled in 1998. A shame too, as the game isn't half bad. and the thrill-kill finales are exhilarating as you edge ever closer to your opponent while the chanting intensifies.
See what you did there.
Despite the fuss over some games, blood and gore were common currency in first-person shooters of the era. From the grim whine of the cerebral boar in Turok 2, Seeds of Evil, or the flash of the Insta-Jib rifle in Unreal Tournament, creating a shower of jibs, or the spectacularly satisfying shotgun dismemberment in the Soldier of Fortune games. It's less the spectacle of violence and more the intent. And games with a criminal bent, like the Grand Theft Auto series, earned the ire of critics for its casual portrayal of reckless law-breaking. Once you broach into psychopath territory, you are almost guaranteed dissension. And in 2003, games like Postal 2 took heavy fire for its more questionable activities. No game has stirred up more of a fuss than Rockstar's Manhunt, however. A murder 'em up in which you play a death row inmate forced to commit creative kills for an unseen director's snuff film. When approaching an enemy, weapon in hand, you can charge up your attack to unleash a progressively more brutal strike, with the kill graphically detailed in a cutscene as your helpless opponent struggles. Although banned in several countries, the game was popular enough to warrant a sequel in 2007.
I never heard
Although
of this
this
game,
was with
actually.
heavy censorship
Rockstar
to avoid
made
the
this?
sales-killing touch of an adults-only rating. In the wake of Manhunt,
Oh, it's
your
banned on
criminal garden
Twitch.
gore seemed to pale in comparison. And so games have since been relatively free to tread down a bloody path.
Really?
Nobody blinked an eye when Half-Life 2 allowed you to launch saw blades at high velocity towards headcrab zombies, severing the torso in two. Or when nearby flames ignited them, with their screams of pain fading as their flesh chars. In 2005, Resident Evil 4 managed to ruffle some feathers with its more gruesome deaths. In one notable instance, a chainsaw-wielding enemy will happily lop your head clean off, swiftly bringing your game to an end. Seems losing your head causes others to do the
You already
same.
played it.
By the start of the 7th console generation, violent games were very much in the mainstream. Titles like Gears of War were an early system seller for the Xbox 360, despite unabashed dismemberment of the series' trademark chainsaw gun. In Dead Space, nobody can hear you scream, as the necromorphs pop out of air vents and rapid
We fucking...
ludicrous jib,
going
a
through
top-down
every game.
exercise in
I play
hyper-violence.
most of these games. History is interesting though. I think. Bug guy says good.